the Rambam for Friday, the 11th of Iyar, the 23rd of April, and we are learning chapter 7 of Hilchos Machalos Asuris of the forbidden foods. Today's chapter focuses on one particular prohibition in terms of our eating, one particular requirement, and that is chelev. Most of us do not aren't even aware of it, even though we observe it every time we eat kosher meat. And that is because today all meat preparation happens at the shlachtois and at the butcher. But by the time it gets to the shelf of any kosher supermarket, whatever you see there is edible, kosher-wise. But one prohibition, which the Torah actually speaks in quite depth, is the prohibition of chelev. Now, we're going to be using a bad translation today, and that is fat. Fat is not necessarily prohibited. It is one particular type of fat which is prohibited. And in fact, there's another word in Hebrew, which is shuman, which also means fat, and that is 100% permitted. Now, where exactly it is, which parts of the animal are the fats prohibited and which parts are permitted, the Torah spells out in quite detail. And in the oral law, in the Gemara, especially in Masechta Chulin, it's explained in much further detail. We're going to go into some of that today. On a practical level, it's mostly out of knowledge that we're learning this. I'm sure the last few days you've learned a lot of things which are very relevant to your own kosher observance. Today won't be exactly in that category, but it's informative. It's good to know what goes into making your meat kosher. Okay. Perek Zayin, Halacha Aleph, chapter 7, Halacha 1. When a person willfully eats an olive-sized portion of forbidden fat, okay, now that's the last time we're going to use the term forbidden fat. The rest of the chapter, the translator just uses the term fat, but remember that it's referring only to chelev. Okay, he is liable for karet, in other words, a severance of the soul from its godly source. And if he partakes of it inadvertently, he must bring a fixed sin offering, chatos kavua. It is explicitly stated in the Torah that he is liable for partaking of the fat of the three species of kosher domesticated animals alone, as Leviticus states, in to partake any fat from an ox, lamb, or goat. This applies whether one partakes of fat from an animal that is ritually slaughtered, or one partakes of fat from a nevela or a treifa from a kosher species. With regard to other domesticated animals and wild beasts, okay, so whether it's a buffalo or a deer or a springbuck, whether non-kosher or kosher, well, those are kosher, the examples I gave, their fat is comparable to their meat. And similarly, the fat of a stillborn fetus of the three species of kosher animals is comparable to its flesh. And when one partakes of an olive-sized portion of it, one is liable for lashes for partaking of an avela. But you don't transgress the more severe prohibition of chelev. When a person partakes of the chelev, again, the forbidden fats of an avela or a treifa, he is liable for partaking of fat and for partaking of an avela or a treifa. Why two? If you remember, there's a principle that the Rambam mentions across all areas of Jewish law, that when you transgress an avera, you're only liable for the more severe one. So why are you here liable for both? The rationale is that since a prohibition is added to its meat, for what it was permitted for beforehand, it is also added to its fat, and hence one's liable for two sets of lashes. Imel, when a person slaughters an animal and finds a fetus in its womb, all of its fat is permitted. This applies even if the fetus is alive, because it is considered as a limb of the mother. If it was carried for the full period of gestation and discovered to be alive, then its fat is forbidden and one is liable for kares for partaking of it. This applies even if the fetus never stepped in the ground and doesn't require ritual slaughter. Instead, we still must remove all the forbidden strands of tissues and membranes from it, as is required with regard to other animals. In other words, when the fetus is somewhat incomplete, if you could call it that, then it's just considered as a limb of the animal, which does not contain any of the fats stipulated in Torah as prohibited, and therefore any part of that animal is permitted. When, however, it's completed, then it takes on a different status. When a person inserts his hand into an animal's womb and cuts off and takes out the fat of a fetus that has undergone a full period of gestation, he is liable for it in the same way as if he cut out the fat of the animal itself. Rationale is the fulfillment of the gestation period is what causes prohibition against fat. So essentially, it depends how developed the fetus is, and if it's a complete calf, then it would be considered like an animal with all laws applicable to it. There are three types of forbidden fat for which one is liable color. Okay, so what is it? It is the fat around the digestive organs, on both kidneys and on the flanks. The fat tail, by contrast, is permitted to be eaten. It is called fat only with regard to the sacrifices. Just as the kidneys and the large lobe of the liver are referred to as fat with regard to the sacrifices, and similarly, you find the expressions the fat of the land and wheat as fat as kidneys when the intent is not fat but choice. Okay, so the Hebrew word chalev, by the way, not to be confused in any way with the Hebrew word chalav, which is milk, but chalev, which is fat. Fat, it can be referring either to the specific prohibited fats, or it can be a figurative term of chalev, the choice, most delicious parts of the land, of the wheat, or of the animal itself. Since the entities are being raised up from sacrifice to be consumed with fire for Hashem, they're called the fat. In other words, the choice portion, for there's nothing more choice than the portion consumed with the fire for God. And for this reason, with regard to Trumas Meiser of grain, right, we say, Beharim chameschel boi mimenu, when you raise the fat. Okay, there's no fat in wheat, but obviously we're referring to the choicest parts. The fat on the abdomen and on the gut is what is meant by the term the fat in the digestive organs. One is liable for the fat at the joints of the thighs on the inside. And this, is what is meant by the term the fat on the flanks. And there is also fat on the maw, which is bent like an arch, and it is forbidden. And there is a ligament that extends like a lobe, and it is permitted. The strands stemming from the fat are forbidden, but one is not liable for cuttings from them. In other words, the strands that go out from the fat. Zion. Chaylev shabasar chayfes, the fat which is covered by meat is permitted. Okay, so when you're eating your steak at Avron's or at the press, or where do you guys go in Joburg? RTG. Okay, that piece of meat that has fat dripping off of it is 100% kosher. Scripture forbids fat on the flanks, but not within the flanks. Similarly, fat on the kidneys is forbidden, not fat within the kidneys. Nevertheless, a person should remove the white matter within the kidney and only then partake of it. It is not necessary, however, to remove all traces of it. There are two cords of fat in the primary loin area near the top of the thigh. And while an animal is alive, this fat can be seen on the intestines. When, however, it dies, one portion of meat will cling to another and cover this fat. And it will not be visible until the portions of meat will be separated from each other. Nevertheless, it is forbidden because that is not fat that is covered by meat. In contrast, whatever you wherever you find fat under meat, with meat covering it and surrounding it in its entirety, so that it will not be seen until the meat is cut away, that fat is permitted. So the layer of fat on the brisket is definitely fine. Enjoy. The fat, to be clear, that fat is not called chalev. Okay, that is what we refer to as shuman. Shuman is the permitted fats of the animal, and that's whatever you'll see on your kosher meats. There are certain parts of the animal where the fats are so enmeshed with the meat that the art of removing it is so complicated. That, and together with the gid hanosha, the special sinew that was prohibited from the fight of Yaakov with the angel, and that's why the forequarter of animals today, at least in South Africa, are just chopped off and sold. Sorry, not the forequarter, the hindquarter is cut off and sold as non-kosher meat because it's so complicated. In Israel, there are slaughterhouses where they are proficient in the art of removing the fats, and actually you can get rump meat in Israel. But in South Africa, you won't find kosher rump meat. The fat of I shouldn't say because it's complicated. It's also takes a lot of time. I do know Rabbi Suiza was trained in removing it, and there were times when he would spend a little bit of extra time and actually prepare some rump meat. The fat test 9. The fat of the heart and the fat of all the small intestines are permitted. Sorry, we did that. They are considered like shuman, which is permitted fat, with the exception of the top of the intestine next to the maw and the beginning of the small intestines, where the fat must be scraped off of it. And this is the fat of the small intestines that is forbidden. There are some of the Geonim who say that the top of the intestine from which the fat must be scraped off is the large intestine. In other words, the colon from which feces are excreted, which is the last of the digestive organs, and it is therefore prohibited in that context. In the body of an animal, there are strands of tissue and membranes that are forbidden. Some are forbidden because of the prohibition against partaking of fat, and others because of that against blood. Whenever a strand of tissue or a membrane is forbidden because of the prohibition, do not partake of any blood, one must remove it, and only then salt the meat, as we explained. If one cut the forbidden blood vessel, it doesn't have to be removed. And similarly, if one roasts the meat, it does not have to be removed. Whenever a strand of tissue or membrane is forbidden because of the prohibition to not partake of any fat, it must be removed. So it has to be taken out from the animal. Whether one's intent is to cut it or to roast it, it needs to go. Any questions? Oh, good. Okay. There are 5 strands of tissue in the flanks, 3 on the right and 2 on the left. Each of the 3 on the right splits into 2, and each of the 2 on the left splits into 3. All are forbidden fats, are forbidden as fat. The strands of tissue from the spleen and from the kidneys are forbidden as fat, and similarly the membrane on the spleen and the membrane above the flanks and the membrane on the kidneys are again forbidden as chaylev, as fat, as forbidden fat. One is liable for kaddius for the membrane on the thick side of the spleen, and the remainder of the membrane is forbidden, but one is not liable for it. Okay. The kidney has 2 membranes. One is liable for kaddius for partaking of the upper one, as one is for partaking of the fat of the kidney itself. And the lower one is like the other membranes. The strands of tissue in them are forbidden, but again, one is not liable for kaddius for them. Yud Gimel, the strands of tissue of the heart, of the foreleg, of the end of the spinal cord, of the lower jaw, those on either side of the tongue, and those within the fat of the small intestines, which are interwoven like spider webs, and the membrane above the brain and the cranium, and the membrane on the testicles, are all forbidden because of the prohibition against partaking of blood. Yudalit, 14. When a kid, a young goat, or a lamb is less than 30 days old, it is permissible to cook its testicles without peeling the membranes from it. In other words, the membranes are considered to have not been developed yet. After 30 days, if thin red lines can be seen within them and it is recognizable, the blood has circulated through them, and one should not cook the testicles until their outer membrane has been removed, or until they have been cut open and salted, as we explained. But if thin red lines have not yet been seen within them, then they are permitted. But after 30 days, it needs to be checked. Tezvav, we do not assume there's blood in any of the digestive organs through which the food passes. Tezayin, it appears to me, in other words, this is a matter of disagreement between the poskim, but the Rambam says that all of these strands of tissue and membranes are forbidden according to rabbinic law. And even if one would say that they are forbidden according to scriptural law and are included in the prohibitions against partaking against any fat or any blood, still one is not liable for lashes for them, only stripes for rebellious conduct. In other words, the punishment would still be midrabanan. Partaking of them is comparable to partaking of half the measure of a forbidden substance, and this is forbidden by scriptural law, yet one is not liable for lashes for it. Okay. Now, what do you do with the fats, especially when you are going to separate the parts that you will be allowed to eat from? We do not, now, so the Rambam says here now about the preparation, we do not salt or wash fat together with meat. Nor should one use a knife used to cut fat, to cut meat, nor a container in which fats were used washed to wash meat. In other words, there is a very, very strong concern of the passing of substance between. Therefore, a butcher should prepare 3 knives, one with which to slaughter, one to actually cut the meat, and one to cut fat. If it is local custom for the butcher to wash the meat in a store, he should prepare 2 containers of water, one in which to wash the meat and one in which to wash the fat. In other words, to separate the kosher fat from the non-kosher fats. It is forbidden for a butcher to spread the fat of the flanks over the meat. In other words, he's going to say, listen, I'm not going to sell the fat, but at least this animal was a meaty cow. No, you're not allowed to do it to make appear to make attractive. The rationale is that the membrane over the fat is thin. It may become crushed by the butcher's hand, and the fat will ooze out and saturate through the meat, which of course would make it prohibited. Although it is forbidden to perform all of these acts, if they are performed, the meat is not forbidden. In other words, you can wash off the meat, nor does the person who punishes them given corporal punishment. Instead, he is taught not to act in this matter. Okay, now we're going to go back into a little bit of the laws of salting the meat, which is just to remove the blood, of course. But meat should not be salted before the forbidden membranes and strands of tissue are removed. If the meat was salted with them, they must be removed after the salting. Even if the gid hanasha was among them, in other words, the most prohibited sinew, one may remove them after salting and then cook the meat. Okay, which is obviously not ideal. And in today's South African shlachtos, this would not be a concern either way because we don't have, as I mentioned before, the hind quarter. Chaf Aleph. When a butcher follows the practice of cleaning meat from forbidden strands of tissues and membranes, and such a strand of membrane is found after he alleged to have cleaned the meat, we teach him and warn him not to act negligently with regard to prohibitions. More stringent rules apply, however, if forbidden fat is found after he alleged to have cleaned the meat. If it is a barley corn in size, he is removed from his position. Okay, meaning if it's an olive-sized portion of forbidden fat, if found, even if in several places, after he is alleged to have cleaned the meat, he is given stripes for rebellious conduct, and he is removed from position. So if it's very small, he just loses his job. But if it's bigger, then he actually gets malchus for it. And the rationale is that a butcher's word is relied upon with regard to fat. And therefore, when we find one butcher not living up to the standards that we expect of kosher butchers, the punishment is particularly severe in order to maintain the trust that we have in the rest of our butcher fraternity. Hashtag Stan and Pete. Any questions?
No, Rabbi.
I'm not a butcher.
I was about to say the same.
Just Shabbat Shalom to everybody.
Shalom, David, Shabbat Shalom, Kent, John, Rifal,
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Obviously, everybody.
Martin, yeah, all the best.